Now, as you might have gathered, one of the big news events this week is President Tinubu's 1 year in office, which falls on the 29th of May, which is today. It was up to the president to decide how the day would be marked, and he chose to be prosaically diplomatic by keeping it low-key. Usually, leaders try to use that day to their advantage. So why has Mr. Tinubu decided to keep it subdued, restrained, and on a small scale, rather than making it seem impressive and important? Well, some would argue that the arrival of his first year in presidential office isn't ideal timing, as it coincides with a torrential outpouring of rather repugnant news indices on the economy, on insecurity, on poverty, and on the mood of Nigerians as they battle through low wages and try to prize the poisonous grip of rising inflation from themselves. And that is the president's only challenge. He and his team also have to face growing opposition as Nigerians wonder whether, once again, they've been dealt a bad hand and whether that promise to change their country and their future for the better has once again fallen flat. A new independent survey by the African Polling Unit suggests that Mr. Tinubu's support, which was already low, has been further dented by anger over soaring crime, rising prices, and deepening poverty. So, is Nigeria on the right track after 1 year of President Tinubu in office and 9 years of his APC party in power, as their supporters insist? Or is an ill wind blowing across this country, as the polls and the opposition suggest? Well, let's take a reflective journey, and for this I'm joined by three of Nigeria's distinguished analysts: the noted political scientist, Professor Ibrahim, chair of the editorial board of Nigeria's Premium Times newspaper and senior fellow at the respected think tank, the Center for Democracy and Development; the professor of international business and former special advisor to President Goodluck Jonathan on performance, monitoring and evaluation, Professor Sylvester Monye; and the current affairs analyst and dean of the School of Postgraduate Studies at Bayes University, Abuja, Professor Adeniyi. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. We are very honored and delighted to have you here. Let me start with you, Professor Ibrahim. One of the strange incongruities, if I may put it that way, of Nigeria is that normal life does go on in the middle of what appears to be an economic war of survival. But is it fair to say that this would have to be one of the most anxious moments for the Nigerian people in a long time? And that is what President Tinubu's first year in office represents for them.
I think it's a moment of deep reflection for Nigerians, because we all remember the campaign. The essence of Tinubu's campaign was that he is a performer, and that his records in Lagos demonstrate that he is a performer. And I think a lot of people thought we are now moving from a regime of non-performance led by Buhari to one of significantly improved performance led by Tinubu, and that did not happen. And that's why people are extremely worried, if not agitated, because all the key problems associated with poor governance, often I will call it non-governance by Buhari, continue to today. And the promises of certain rapid actions taken exactly 1 year ago on Inauguration Day that was supposed to bring life back into the economy and society have not appeared at all. And people are wondering if the next 3 years will be a repeat of this first year. Then Nigeria, it will be at a turning point, because the level of misery and suffering is so high that we may tumble over the edge.
Well, thanks for that opening assessment. Let me come to you, Professor Monye. Of course, 1 year of the Tinubu administration, but 9 years in power for his APC party. 9 years, just short of a decade, is quite a long time for any political party to retain power. Is there a sense that there is much to show for it or not?
Well, thank you very much for putting it in context. First of all, the present administration has tried to separate itself from the Buhari era. But unfortunately, it is impossible to do so because it's the same family, the same party. And indeed, Tinubu is famous for supporting or indeed bringing Buhari to office. So he can't really separate the two administrations. I think what we are facing is a situation where you overpromise and completely underdeliver. We were in ground zero with the Buhari administration. And therefore, the promise was Tinubu a performer. He did magic in Lagos. He was coming to repeat the same thing in Abuja. And of course, his inaugural speech was powerful. You recall that it was in that speech that he talked about so many of the major policy ideas that he proposed, like subsidy. When he was saying that subsidy was gone, it was quite nice. It sounded good. But what has happened is that their campaign messages have not been turned into actionable program. That is really the issue. So they have overpromised, but have not been able to put together a team of people to help them synthesize the message into actionable plan. And that's really part of the challenge, that you promise, the expectation is high, and that is why it's been assessed in a very harsh way, in my opinion.
Well, thanks for that. And let me bring you in, Professor Adeniyi, in our off-site studio. I mean, I presume you can hear what we're saying here, or even though it's the same APC party that's been in power, but would you say that there is a marked difference between the administrations of President Buhari and President Tinubu, and the emphasis they put on battling the big problems and issues of Nigeria, Nigeria is confronted with at the moment, or is there a sense of continuity in your assessment?
Well, Charles, I think it's just largely one of continuity, you know. I haven't seen anything that is disruptive and that is consequential enough that will yield different results in key sectors of the economy, of the Nigerian society, be it economy, politics, culture, health, education, etc. Yes, we have seen attempts, we've seen trials, you know, we've seen policy decisions, we've seen directions, you know, but of course we have seen some lethargy or some reluctance in the ability of the administration, you know, to execute some of these policies. You know, again, we need to underscore the fact that we exist in a system, in a political atmosphere, where parties are necessarily special purpose vehicles. They are not necessarily funded on any ideology. There's no particular ideology that you can place around APC, for instance, you know, so such that from Buhari to Tinubu, you will see some level of consistency, further to, you know, obedience, you know, further to a determination to follow their ideology. That's not what we'll have. What we'll have is, you know, different personalities reflecting on governance, you know, as the case could be. And of course, otherwise, one would have expected some level of disruption disruption at the level of economy, disruption of the political process in such a way that it will no longer, it will not be business as usual. What we have been witnessing in the last 1 year has unfortunately been business as usual, even though the administration seems to be trying to find silver lining in dark cloud, trying to make lemonade out of sour grapes, but we know how challenging this can be. Maybe at some point in the conversation, we'll get to, making projections on, some of their efforts. But in this circumstance, the last 1 year has been one that we cannot actually mark as being excellent or being very good or even good, even though the attempts are very obvious, as the case could be.
Thank you, Prof. We'll come back to you in a hot second. But let me come to you, Professor Ibrahim. Does the mood in the country suggest, as a result of what everybody's said here right now, does it suggest a swing of the pendulum away from support for the APC after 9 years? Or are people prepared to give President Tinubu the benefit of the doubt because he himself, beyond the APC, has only been in office for 1 year? I mean, can the two be separated, or are people simply tired already?
I think people are not really thinking in terms of party. They are thinking in terms of government. And government has made promises to deliver, and government is not delivering. But what people are really thinking about is the precariousness of their lives. One, being on the road, traveling, even sitting in your house, people coming with arms, kidnap you, take you away for ransom. And the extended family have to sell all their properties to raise money to try to rescue you. And just to make you doubt whether there's any point in rescue, sometimes the ransom is paid and they kill you anyway. The other issue is the spread of violence and criminality which remain unchecked all over the country. The cost of living has created a crisis in which people fall sick. Curing malaria today is a major endeavor because of the escalation of the costs of drugs. People wonder, why do Nigerians pray so much today? It's because they fall sick, they can't pay for drugs. So the only alternative for them is to pray. And prayer, of course, is good, but sometimes these malaria parasites refuse to listen to your powerful prayers. So it's this precariousness of life that you are unsafe in this country. And for a great number of Nigerians, the most basic sense of insecurity is they can't get their 3 square meals a day. And they are hungry a lot of the time. Are we surprised people get very angry and people fall into mental sickness because of the constraints they are living under? Those are really the issues. So we are now past thinking, is APC performing or not? People are saying, the fact of the matter, if the Constitution defines governance as the security and welfare of Nigerians, then we don't have government at all. What we have is people enjoying themselves at the top, taking care of themselves, but for the people, there's zero government. And this is a very dangerous situation for any country to be in, because self-help then becomes a generalized ideology. Increasingly, Nigerians are saying, let me look for money to buy arms. Now, as more and more people buy arms, what's going to happen? You're not going to reach the people in government. You're going to turn on your neighbor who has maybe just as little as you have, and you take the little your neighbor has. And that's the pathway to anarchy. That's the real risk we are facing in this country, is past whether this government is performing or not, but that people are in deep personal and family crisis, and they feel their survival is at stake, and they need to do something drastic if they are to continue to survive in this country.
I think that's a very, very powerful statement that you've made there, and I couldn't have put it better myself, and I expect that many people would agree with your assessment. But let me put it this way to you, Professor Monye. Is it really just up to the federal government? I mean, we know, for instance, that the issue of security falls under the federal government, no question about that. But there's also a division of labor as far as that is concerned with the state governments. And when it comes to the other things that Professor Ibrahim was talking about, hunger in the land, poverty, services, welfare and so on. I mean, the states have a large chunk of that responsibility. Are we letting them get away with it by simply focusing on the federal government?
Well, thank you very much. That's a useful question. Let me say that the problem that we have today is the inability of the APC administration to galvanize the real quality caliber of people to help them govern the country. They seem to forget that there's a difference between campaign and governance. In my opinion, when you listen to them talk, in some cases, they're still in the campaign mode, talking about themselves and the opposition party. That time has gone. We'll finish with campaign. This is the time for governance. What they need to do first is to mobilize support across party line. The country is in such a mess that President Tinubu and his group can't do much. They are doing very well. They are trying their best. But is their best good enough? The answer is no. You need to mobilize credible support and gain some legitimacy in some of the things that they are doing. But they are not doing that. That's point number one. Point number two, there is this assumption that federal government knows it all. I have had the privilege of working both at the federal level as well as the state level. And I know that there's a huge disconnect between the states and the federal government. And unfortunately, the states is the hub of activities. What you find in Nigeria today is a total disconnect in policy, in implementation, in understanding of the direction for the government. We have a situation where attempts are being made to create powerful individuals instead of building institutions. We don't have institutions. Some of the institutions we have collapsed. I'll give you one good example that I'm familiar with, National Planning Commission. They have the mandatory, the statutory responsibility of designing a work plan for the country. The Renewed Hope Agenda was a campaign policy document. That should have been given to the institution to tease out and develop a medium-term work plan. Right now, we are groping in the dark. We don't have a work plan. We don't have a roadmap. So when Professor Jibril says people are in despair, it is true because there's no hope, there's no direction. Nobody can tell you this is where we're going, this is where we're headed, because there's no roadmap. So I don't think it's too late. This is only 1 year of this administration. What they need to do is to get back on track, get the legitimacy that the government deserves, get the states to be part of their bigger plan, and get well-meaning Nigerians to advise and get them together. You will recall that in 1999, President Obasanjo inherited a near hopeless situation. What he did with his maturity was to bring everybody on board. People from different parties, people from different ethnic nationalities, and coupled a government of national unity. Even though he never called it a government of national unity, but that gave him a lot of legitimacy. And that gave a lot of people ownership of what was going on. And I expect that there will be changes after this first year because the policies are not working.
Right. Well, let me come to you then. We lost your comms there for a minute, but I am assured that you're back with us, so we're very glad for that. Professor Adeniyi, in the past, I don't know if you heard a lot of the very interesting comments and analysis that we had from Professor Ibrahim and Professor Monye there. But in the past week, we've seen President Tinubu's cabinet ministers presenting their achievements and goals to the public to mark this 1 year in office. Do you get the sense that they are rowing back or rowing forward? In other words, what's your assessment of how they've shaped and actualized this administration's core objectives?
Yeah, first, Charles, I think there was a point I mentioned some times ago that we still have a problem of having an overarching ideology around which the efforts of the ministers, agency heads, will be shaped so that beyond the sing-song of a Renew Hope agenda, we can have something that is developmental, that is growth-oriented, much more structural, much more foundational, as the case could be. But in terms of specifics, yes, we have seen some ministers who are actually, you could see they are shining lights of the administration, and of course, they are very obvious. Some of them are very obvious. FCT minister, from what we see around Abuja, in the last 1 year, quite commendable. Infrastructure, some of them abandoned for many years, they are coming back to life. There's a new boost in the city, and it's a good thing that we are seeing the commissioning of some of these structures. But what we expect is that the effort will extend, to the countrysides, to the downsides, not just in the city center alone, because FCT is much more than the city center. And of course, the internal minister for interior has also not done badly. We have seen efforts even much earlier than now. Remain another shining light, another silver lining, so to say. And of course, the education minister too. Although very quiet, but obviously very effective. We understand the much he's doing just to prevent ASU from getting provoked once again, and beyond that, we are mindful of his efforts at reducing the number of out-of-school children. The early release of the education work plan is also another thing that comes to mind, and of course, the resolution of the crisis around IPs, is something that was quietly resolved as well, even though there are still pockets of agitation in that sector. And of course, the aviation minister, naturally gung-ho. I have no reason to doubt that he's not succeeding where he is. From public projections, public representation, as the case could be, and the health ministers too. Yes, that's another shining light. We have seen promise around the need to commission some projects, facilities, realizing the shortfall in this sector and how critical it can be. But of course, he's got to be reminded again that beyond those projects, beyond those facilities, is a need for the administration to engender confidence in the health sector and to prevent, the exportation of Nigerian medicals abroad, which is a fundamental disservice, to the health of our own healthcare system, as the case could be. And maybe, those are the ones I can immediately remember, but I think beyond this individual ministers, it's also the need for us to look at the team as a whole. What about the team? If we are just able to mention just a few out of 48, then that's not salutary enough. So we need a lot more of them, to be achieving, so that we can mention some more names, And of course, we need that team spirit, beyond individual identification. We need, that team projection, because the president, of course, will not be thinking or not necessarily thinking about individuals coming to be rated as outstanding at the expense of the others. So it's the whole picture that matters, not necessarily the unit, as the case could be. But like my colleagues have said, 1 year so far, Nothing much to write home about, but if they can redouble their efforts, 3 years is more than enough for the administration to prove its worth and probably justify the expectations of the people, which was very high, on the back of his 8 years in Lagos, which was, and of course, against the background of the promise we were given, that he was going to transport the celebrated, touted achievements in Lagos to the center.
Okay, and we've got just about a minute and a half, Prof, but we will come back, obviously, after we've taken a break. But, I mean, Professor Ibrahim, you listened to some of those ministers. Are they coming up with innovative ways of dealing with issues in your assessment?
I think some of them appear to be making significant progress, but the problem is always to be able to differentiate a good publicity staff ratio that amplifies what is being done. But of course, over time, we are going to be seeing more clearly. But I think the real story is that a lot of the ministers have been, we've been wondering, why were they made ministers? Both because of their previous history of incompetence, but even more because of the key problem that affects this country's governance, which is the question of corruption. At the very beginning of this regime, a minister was found to have pocketed virtually the entire budget of the ministry. And the details were revealed. It was one of the biggest scandals in the history of this country. She was suspended, and we've had nothing. And, in this country, we always say, look for the body language. What does that signify in body language? Is it that the corrupt will be supported and covered up? That's the question for us.
And that's an important question, and we will come back to the nettlesome issue of corruption later in this program. You're watching Arise Prime Time. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our analysis of how President Tinubu is getting on after 1 year in office. Stay with us. Now, as you may have noticed, there's been no let-off of fireworks and no dancing in the streets in Nigeria as President Tinubu marks his 1 year in office. The estimate of opinion inside Nigeria, according to a new independent API survey, is that more than 80% of Nigerians are dissatisfied with the current state of affairs and feel the country is headed in the wrong direction. And that estimate is not surprising, given that Mr. Tinubu won the 2023 election with just about 37% of the votes cast. So, after 1 year in office, what gains has he been responsible for, and what losses have occurred under his presidency? How unsettling a time has it been for an administration that's enjoyed the lowest level of public support for any administration since the return to democracy in 1999? Is there a noticeably frail feel about Nigeria today, or has the Tinubu administration done rather well with the boldness of the policy decisions it's had to make in a country that desperately needs bold reforms, even if in the short term those policies have piled on the misery for most Nigerians? And with me in the studio are expert analysts who are helping us to assess the last 12 months of the Tinubu presidency and beyond. The noted political scientist, Professor Ibrahim, chair of the editorial board of Nigeria's Premium Times newspaper and senior fellow at the think tank, the Center for Democracy and Development. The professor of international business and former special advisor to President Goodluck Jonathan on performance, monitoring and evaluation, Professor Sylvester Monye, and the current affairs analyst and dean of the School of the Postgraduate Studies at Bayes University, Abuja, Professor Adeniyi. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for staying with us. And before we went on a break, we rather rudely, sadly interrupted Professor Ibrahim because we had run out of time and we had to go on a break. But I think, let me come back to you, Professor Ibrahim, because Professor Monye made a very interesting point before we took that break. He was talking about the absence of a roadmap by which you can hold the administration to account. So, for instance, if you said that there were 20 million children out of school, and you said you were going to every year or in the next 4 years put back 10 million into school, and every year you'd say we'll put back this many or that many, you can use that as a way of assessing how far they've come. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's very basic. The first point I'll make on that is that the president did appoint somebody in charge of monitoring of the ministries and public officials. But that office has not explained to Nigeria what are the indices they are using, what's the methodology, how are we going to know whether or not these ministers are performing. You know, it was quite interesting. The other day I was watching the Minister of Marine and Blue Economy talking in very grandiose language about the billions and billions that Nigeria is going to make from these new sets of new sets of activities associated with the blue economy, blue and marine economy. But there was no mention in terms of, well, this is a new sector, so what are the areas you are going to go into? In what sense does Nigeria has a comparative advantage? Spell out the programs you are talking about that will produce the billions, but don't talk to us about billions that and vast activities without even indicating what sorts of activities you have been working on for 1 year. Definitely, at the end of 1 year, there must have been a clear sense what are the sectors that Nigeria should go into in this new area where governance has not been present previously. But there was really nothing about that. It's just a lot of talk. And watching the ministers, the president had announced that Hadiza Bala Usman will be watching and scoring them. And I had the sense that they are trying to please Hadiza Bala Usman. So it's all about praising themselves. I've done great things, I've performed a lot. And then you look for the content, you wait to hear the content, and there's basically nothing on the content. Yeah, you had meetings with this and this. Oh, there's this area you are going into. What have you done so far? Where are you on that route? And what are you promising us in the next 6 months, in the next 1 year, for the rest of the 3 years that you are going to be in power? This lack of concreteness in terms of the outputs they will be engaged in is very basic. But we know in evaluation, at the end of the day, it's not the output that matters. It's the outcome. What you do, is it going to change things for the better? That's what people are really interested in. But when we don't even know what are the activities you want to do, the question of performance evaluation doesn't arise because there's nothing to evaluate. It's just a lot of hot air about great things you'll be doing, only that nobody knows what those great things are.
I have to say that when you were talking there, we were off camera, but I think we all chuckled a bit. The way that you sort of you assessed some of the things that you were talking about. I mean, I think anybody who's been to the Nigerian presidency would notice a kind of spectacular insularity in there, where everybody is just focused on trying to impress the man who's given them a job, and you can flush the rest of the country down the toilet. But I mean, coming to you, Professor Monye, you listened to those ministers evaluating their scorecards and so on. Is there a sense that they are of a lower or a higher caliber? After all, I mean, they are the custodians of the future of this country as individuals.
Well, first of all, I have a lot of sympathy for them, because some of them have no practical experience in governance and therefore are lost in the politics of governance. Now, let me be practical here. One of the best ranked ministers is the Minister of Interior. The reason why he's very well ranked is because he came and said, we have issues with passport, backlog. Give me 2 weeks. I will sort it out. And in 2 weeks, I think in a little over 2 weeks, he came back and said, I've cleared the backlog. He said that the Nigerians suffer a lot traveling to get visa, particularly those abroad. He mentioned Canada specifically. And he said, give me time, I will sort it out. He did. He also came and said, there are issues with our prisons, our correctional centers. He's been doing a lot. So people see him and benchmark him based on targets and delivery. And that is the point I've been making, that you can't really assess anybody without those parameters. You must know what you're assessing. If you ask me, our colleague said earlier about Minister of Education, he has done very well. And one of the things he did was to manage ASU. I mean, can that be an achievement? The answer is no, unless he stated that in his performance contract that I am going to manage ASU. If he does that, yes, you say, okay, he said he was going to manage ASU, and he has done so. But you couldn't possibly say, I am going to create 1,000 kilometers of road in the next 6 months. But at the end of the six months, assuming you've done 300 instead of 1,000, say, well, I had promised that I would do 1,000 kilometers, but I've only done 300. And the reason why I've not been able to do 1,000 is because of A, B, C, D. So you are assessing somebody based on actual indicators. But right now, everybody is trying to be popular by indicating activities. Activities do not translate to outcomes. They are there, they are busy, but they are not giving us the result we require.
Well, let me come to you, Professor Adeniyi, because a reference was made to you there, and the fact that you talked about ASU. ASU, of course, is the academic staff of universities. So it would be obviously your right to respond to that. But I want to just talk about this briefly, and then we'll move on to other things, because we've got about just 15 minutes or so. It's amazing how time flies. But Professor Adeniyi, you're not trying to be a glass half empty kind of person or particularly dystopian, but listening to Professor Ibrahim and Professor Monye, we know the challenges are on the economy, on poverty, on security and more, and we're going to talk about security in a moment. But the question is whether they are micro or macro, whether there are serious attempts by this government to address them. Briefly.
Okay, first, I'm not sure if Professor Monye was listening to me, when I made my intervention with respect to specific ministers. And of course, referring to education minister, I said, yes, it's been largely quiet, but also quietly effective. And I reference ASU, because oftentimes it's often too easy for ASU to get provoked, rightly or wrongly. And of course, we know how these affects the tertiary education system in this country. So any government that is concerned about managing ASU in terms of meeting their needs, their aspirations, I think that government deserves some level of commendation, And of course, I went beyond ASU to talk about, how with the efforts they are making with respect to addressing out-of-school children. Then, of course, the question of IPs. Then, of course, if you look at the Education Ministry's response, when there was controversy around some universities in the West African sub-region, how they quickly responded, and of course to the issue of fake certificate in tertiary education as well. There were so many issues where I didn't just talk about as in isolation, Prof. And of course, to your question, yeah, it's about effort, you know. There are a number of monkey wrenches on our part. You know, corruption is one of them, you alluded to it. And of course, there's still some disparity between microeconomics and microeconomics. And of course, if you are talking about specifics, we know how this government came in terms of trying to disrupt the economy only in that sector, even though it's not been positive. We know how they remove subsidy on oil, on electricity, Band A, those in the Band A group, and of course how they remove subsidy on foreign exchange as well. We know the effect this has had on small and medium scale enterprises, you know, the effect it has on people at the lower rung of the economic ladder. The effect is continuing. Yeah, you know, and if we can imagine, as the case could be, that this could be short-term difficulties, you know, and of course in the longer run there might be stability and sustainability. We can never tell, but in the short term the pain is there, the pain is obvious, and that's the point I'm trying to make. The pain is there, and what has government really done in this circumstance to alleviate the pain? Perhaps we have had them, they've come up with different sets of announcements, but of course the pain has been the execution. This has to be reiterated again. So if those measures have been well executed, perhaps we'll have had the pain cushioned, as the case could be. Then even if we have to wait in the long term to get the benefit, then of course the complaint, you know, the pain that the people are facing presently may not be before us, you know. So that's what I think, really. I think it's a lot of effort that they still need to put into the fray, you know, going by the signals we have seen. I think I think those efforts can actually lead to success at the end of the day.
Right. Okay. We've got that point. Let's move away because time is slipping away relentlessly from us. Let's turn to something that Professor Ibrahim touched on earlier, which is the security situation, which has bedeviled Nigerian life in virtually every part of the country. That was one of Mr. Tinubu's priorities, but it's not been a great story so far, has it, Professor Ibrahim? Just drill deeper into that, because you did mention it previously.
I think one of the specific promises the president made during the campaign was that he's done an analysis of the security crisis that we have in this country, and that part of what he had discovered was there wasn't sufficient personnel to handle the scale of the problem. Coming into power, I had expected some details. Okay, how are we, just the way Professor Monye was talking about, how many more personnel are you going to recruit for the Army, for the Navy, for the Air Force, for the police? What are your timelines? You are going to spread this over what time? The question of technology that the president has mentioned, how are you going to put that into implementation? But we are not hearing anything about those details and those plans. But what everybody is hearing is that on a daily basis, incidents of criminal attacks, militant attacks, terrorist attacks are increasing. And more Nigerian communities are being dragged into this nets of insecurity. And there's a clear downward trend in terms of public safety. And the problem has reached a level where the response of state governments is to say, okay, we don't have the mandate to work on this, but clearly since the federal government is not doing as much as we expected it would, we will enter into the fray and have our own core of people that will be involved in checkmating this insecurity. Now the issue is, since they don't have a mandate for that, what's the framework? What's the national framework that will guide what they can do, what they cannot do? We know that you cannot, for example, arm them by law in this country. I understand they are being armed. Who is over watching all this to make sure that we are not disregarding completely the realms of public law?
Right.
And how do we make sure that in their own activities, they do not begin to harm citizens they are supposed to be protecting?
Well, there's no question, is there, Professor Monye, that there is a big problem of insecurity in Nigeria. But on balance, would you agree with the administration when they say that the change, for instance, in service chiefs has been a positive move, and that we're seeing less terror activity in terms of Boko Haram and ISWAP, even if there's more sort of banditry and kidnapping and all that sort of thing?
Well, first of all, they're just deceiving themselves and deceiving Nigerians. You see, there are policies that the administration came in with. One of those is the issue of state police. They came out, it's a very clear policy direction that they want to pursue. It is inconceivable for federal police or federal security to deal with the type of insecurity we have in Nigeria today. If you travel around the world, you find out that policing is highly localized, to the extent that in some areas abroad, you have what they call community police, you have neighborhood watch. Everything is local. It is impossible for a police DPO from Jigawa State to know my village so well that he would now be fully in charge of policing. It is not. However, it has been agreed by 80% of the states in Nigeria that they will go for state police. It's taking too long. Now, I will not be able to say they have done well in security because those building blocks have not been put in place. If they have done or started the process of state police administration, you say, okay, they are doing well. We're not seeing the result yet, but they're in the right direction. There is no movement. And therefore, you can tell me from here to tomorrow about insecurity, kidnapping, kinetic security, all those flowery language that people use, nice. But the effect is, are we any safer? The answer is no. What can we do? A lot. One of them is state policing. But before you
very briefly,
jump in here,
we've got about 20 seconds.
Not so long ago, some people were kidnapped in Uromi in Edo State. Some policemen couldn't do anything. They got the local vigilante to go into the forest. And in less than 24 hours, the local vigilante was able to do what the police couldn't do, i.e. fishing out the kidnappers.
And that supports your argument of for local
policing, because you need to know the place. You need to understand the language.
Unfortunately, we are out of time. There's so much more to talk about, especially when we're very privileged to have three of you here, three professors, three expert analysts. Unfortunately, time is against us, but I want to thank you very much indeed, starting with you, Professor Sylvester Monye, who was our last speaker. He's a former special advisor to President Goodluck Jonathan on performance monitoring and evaluation. He's also a professor of international business. Of course, Professor Ibrahim, a noted political scientist, chair of the editorial board of Nigeria's Premium Times newspaper, and senior fellow at the respected think tank, the Center for Democracy and Development, and the current affairs analyst and dean of the School of Postgraduate Studies at Bayes University, Abuja, Professor Abiodun Adeniyi. Thank you very much indeed. That's it for this edition of Arise Prime Time. Join us again tomorrow. From me and the entire team here in Abuja, bye-bye and thank you for watching.